So, a very warm welcome to this webinar on behalf of the OU Palestine Solidarity Group. The title of this webinar is Confronting the World's 21st Century Colonial Genocide. In a moment, I will hand over to Les, who will provide more context to the topic and will introduce our speakers. For now, in order to ask a question, please go to the right-hand side of the MS Teams chat and choose question from the drop-down list. If we do get a lot of questions, we will need to be selective, so apologies in advance if your question is not addressed. You can like other people's questions too if you would like them answered. In terms of our code of conduct, I have put this into the Q&A area, but to be clear, we request that everyone uses respectful language. We will not accept any form of discrimination or harassment, whether based on race, gender, sex, sexual orientation, beliefs, age, disability, religion, or lack thereof, or socioeconomic background. And we encourage anyone who has experienced or witnessed any form of discrimination or harassment during this webinar to alert us. Now I will hand over to Les. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Fernaz. Welcome to our webinar. I think it's the 10th in the series since we began in autumn 2023. I'll briefly summarize the topic for today, as in the summary in the publicity text, then briefly speak about the relevance to the OU, and then hand over to the main speakers. So, confronting the world's 21st century colonial genocide. Since Israel's genocide against Gaza began in October 2023, commonplace analyses of responsibility have come in concentric circles. Starting with the innermost, responsibility has been variously attributed to Israeli politicians, or to the Israeli military, or to its settler-colonial political culture, or to the USA's massive military aid, or, most broadly, to Western imperialism and global racial capitalism. Here we extend the latter analyses by situating Israel's ongoing genocide in the wider, deeper world that we call colonial modernity. This concept understands colonial relations as generating modernity, both in the past and the present, thus inverting the hegemonic stereotype that modernity has superseded colonial relationships. Colonial modernity theorises today's processes of concentrating modern power as re-enacting colonial relations. Colonial modernity enmeshes 6 such relations, assuming comprehensive superiority, asserting military supremacy, enforcing gender domination, appropriating cultural privileges, extending imaginations of control, and expanding toxic extractions. By extending those relations, this globally hegemonic world has made the genocide in Gaza, while at the same time also being remade by it, thus constituting Israel's attack as a 21st century colonial genocide. Earlier forms of violent colonial socio-materiality are enacted in new and horrific ways in this genocide. Their deeply constitutive colonial relations will persist unless counterforces are adequately mobilized to confront them. Although Israel's genocide is an extreme case, its colonial relations highlight modern modes that have wider relevance. Beyond demanding the end of Israel's colonial violence, we must avoid its repetition by directly confronting modernity's colonial relations towards a decolonial transformation. So that concludes the summary, which will be elaborated soon in the main talks. Here I'd add a comment really on behalf of the OU Palestine Solidarity Group. Colonial modernity remains deeply embedded in most Western institutions unless they have consciously targeted and contested that framework. Colonial modernity underlies hegemonic narratives of progress, including academic pedagogy and research. Some colonial relations have been revealed by efforts to decolonize universities, likewise by protest against their complicity with Israel's colonization of Palestine, and more recently, its genocide. We are based at the OU, so here are 3 brief examples of the OU's complicity. First, a colonial narrative of the endemic violence, such as in the cliché The Cycle of Violence, whose driver always remains a mystery. After the Hamas attack of 7th October, about a week later, the OU issued its first ever statement about Israel-Palestine. Why then? Because many Israelis had been killed. Perhaps they count more than Palestinian lives. The OU statement was entitled, quote, "The Israel-Hamas War," thus sanitizing Israel's colonial war against the entire Palestinian people. According to the OU statement, many Israelis were murdered. By contrast, many Palestinians died. How did they die? The statement didn't say how. In our first webinar entitled "The Israel-Palestine Issue Comes to the OU," we did a critical discourse analysis of the OU statement. Namely, it reproduced the hegemonic narrative of the US, UK, and Israeli regimes. If you want to see that in detail, then we'll put the YouTube link in the chat. So this OU statement was a racist colonial form of psychological warfare. This made many OU staff and students feel frightened about speaking out, and that perhaps was one incentive for us to create the OU and for Ceasefire in Gaza Group, and then change its name to the OU Palestine Solidarity Group. Second example, colonial modernity also involves financial investment, which has become routine and deeply embedded. The OU's investments feature the Troy Trogan Ethical Fund, including 7 companies complicit with Israel's colonization of Palestine. 2 are big tech companies, Microsoft and Google. They both have provided crucial electronic systems, making the Israeli offense force more lethal, especially in Gaza. Our divestment campaign has emphasized this complicity. The OU administration has responded to our campaign with 2 basic arguments: that this ethical fund has no arms companies, therefore no problem, and that OU staff have diverse views about Israel-Palestine. So the administration has evaded its complicity with Israel's genocide. You will hear more about big tech from today's speakers. The third example are the OU careers fairs. These feature BA systems, whose weapons have been central to Israel's long-time attacks on Gaza, as well as war crimes in many other places. Our student group, the OU Friends of Palestine, initiated a demand that the OU cease hosting arms companies. This demand became part of our divestment campaign. The administration has responded that its careers fairs simply offer an opportunity for students. Indeed, the fairs respect and perhaps encourage their individual free choice to collude with war crimes. Such institutional narratives warrant more scrutiny as integral to colonial modernity. So now let's move on to the main speakers. So the article that we pre-circulated was co-authored by me and the 3 others who were advertised as speakers. The first 2, Professor Sarah Aurora and Dr. John O'Sullivan, will do the presentation, and then all 3 of us, including Andy Sterling, will be available to respond to your questions. And those 2 talks will be followed by a commentary by Professor Tarir Hamdi of the Arab Open University in Jordan. So, let's begin with Sarab Aurora.
I'm muted. Thank you, Les, for the introduction. I'm going to try and share my slides, which is not always straightforward, but let's hope it works this time. Okay, yeah. I hope my screen's visible. Right? Les, can you confirm the screen's visible?
Yes, it's visible.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Okay, so Les has already done a great job of introducing the talk. What I and Kian are going to do, we're going to use some slides to elaborate some of the points that Les has already introduced. And of course, the title of the talk is here, which is based upon an essay that we did a few months ago. In fact, we finished it in January, but then it was only published about a month or so ago on this website here, which the address I'm including here. So obviously, I'm happy to share the slides later for those who will be interested. So yeah, that's it. Thanks for having us talk about it. So let's hope we can have a good discussion later. So what's the outline of the talk? I am going to begin by asking the question, what is the point today of doing conceptual work when genocidal violence is still being inflicted in Gaza? So that's the first thing that I will ask. And of course, I'll here reflect and build upon others who have done conceptual work using concepts such as racial capitalism and Western imperialism. And then we'll move on to our own conceptual approach, concept that we think works in some ways, is more elaborate and more holistic, and helps appreciate concerns and issues that are otherwise kept separate from each other. So it helps bring them together. And then finally, we will discuss the relevance of the concept in relation to the genocide, obviously, in Gaza, and discuss the 6 different dimensions or relations of this concept in that context, or at least hopefully maybe not all of those 6, but definitely some of those 6, and especially in terms of how they relate to military supremacy, because that's obviously central to the making of this genocide in Gaza today. So, and finally, of course, some concluding remarks about the importance of anti-colonial and decolonial reparations in Palestine and beyond. So I move now to the question that I want to ask, sort of why do this work today, when obviously efforts can be fruitfully expended in directly resisting through activism on the streets and movements against the genocide. So our argument really is, of course, we academics and we do conceptual work. So obviously there's that argument to be made here that it's because of who we are doing this work. But we also believe that there's definitely some degree of complementarity here of this kind of work, of conceptual work, to more direct, more street-based, more movement-based activism that is obviously even today extremely urgent and directly necessary. Concepts of the kinds that we are going to discuss today, and the concept of colonial modernity in particular that we are going to elaborate on and then try to illustrate, I think they are important because they help us understand how movement building, in this case for pro-Palestine activism, can be co-opted, can be marginalized, can be thwarted by the same formations, same political formations, same forces that are behind the genocide in Gaza. We can also then, concepts can also be useful for asking what kinds of alternative focal formations might be there in the world, might be possible in the world, alternatives to the political formation that is inflicting the violence. So, for example, in the case of capitalism, we know the alternatives that are often forwarded rest in ideas of socialism, ideas of communism, and so on. So those would be the alternatives that perhaps are more useful in some senses of the word to support political struggles for freedom and justice. And finally, and perhaps most central to our talk today, concepts are deeply important to grasp complicities that extend around the world today, particularly beyond the so-called West and its governments. And that West also often gets centered on the United States, primarily because that, of course, that country happens to be the largest supporter of Israeli violence and Israeli settler-colonialism for the longest of times. Now, so in the literature, obviously, there is already some work on these concepts, and we are, of course, not providing a complete review of that literature. Although that is something that's work in the making at the moment, we are writing it up. But initial outlines, initial view of the literature suggests that there are there are different ways in which people have approached, different conceptual approaches that people have applied to apprehend these global complicities. And the formations that people forward, the first among them is, of course, Western imperialism, or some people call it Western imperial order. And here the aim really is to understand, and of course it is helpful in grasping how Western support is provided to the Zionist project, and how that Western support rests on a particular history spanning back 5 centuries, beginning with the domination in the Americas back in the 16th century, and then follows down from there, and also highlights how that power and privilege of the West that has been constructed over the last 5 centuries today rests upon centrally upon the geopolitical importance of the Middle East, not least even continuing today in terms of the fossil fuels and so on. But our argument there is the ongoing genocide in Gaza, in many ways has gone far beyond any threat that might have been posed by the Houthis or otherwise to resource extraction and trade that is required from and through the Middle East. So something else is going on in addition. And of course, settler-colonial studies are extremely useful in explaining what is going on, particularly on the ground, and explaining how the model of ethnic cleansing that is currently visible and that has been visible across Palestine, and apartheid and occupation, how they came to be enacted in Palestine, in the sense how they have the global flow of these models of settler colonialism from the United States onto Canada and elsewhere into Palestine. But the focus here of settler-colonial studies is often on individual territories, often within the circumscribed borders of nation states, rather than on global flows of people, global flows of finances, resources, materials, technologies, knowledges, and so on. And here, in this sense, focusing on global exploitation and global exchange and global extraction of different kinds of resources, different kinds of even people from around the world, particularly during the era of enslavement, is attended to by the concept of racial capitalism. Now, of course, this literature has done a great job in showing how racism is constitutive of capitalist enterprise, capitalist exploitation, capitalist growth and progress, and so on. But it does tend to neglect forces other than white supremacy, so other than racism, other than capitalist interests. Now, some of these forces are quite prominent in the world today, in our view. Forces of authoritarian nationalism, for example, in the hands of a Modi in India, that kind of Hindu nationalism is providing immense support to the state of Israel today, which wasn't the case perhaps 3 or 4 decades ago in India that I grew up in. And equally, racial capitalism studies, while doing amazing work in many other ways, often tend to downplay, often tend to not fully attend to the destructive power held by modern technosciences today, and how they underpin beyond what they can be determined by capitalist relations or interests, all kinds of destruction of ways of being, ways of knowing, and people and their bodies, obviously. So we think the globally hegemonic world that includes attending to these issues that are perhaps to some extent neglected in these other formations, other concepts, can be done more effectively using colonial modernity as a concept. And obviously, the literature around modernity is gigantic, to say the least. Mainstream humanities and social sciences have developed this concept for at least a century, if not longer. And in these globally dominant framings of modernity, certain kinds of historical political processes are emphasized or foregrounded. And central among them, I'm only going to list about 10 here. Obviously, there are more processes that one could identify and that exist in the literature. But individualization of people, individualization of people's life courses, individualization of people's identities, even to the neglect of other identities, for example, is quite common as a modern feature. Disenchantment from tradition, disenchantment also from spirituality, sacredness, and of nature more generally, and disenchantment in the sense that nature might be removed from culture and considered as a separate entity. That is elaborated, theorized as a central feature of modernity. Rationalization, rationalization that is done of reality through modern thought, particularly modern science, the formation of nation states and their borders from diverse peoples and regions around the world. And of course, we see that as the hegemonic system around the world today that we don't often even question these nation states and their borders. Capitalism and capitalization of the economy, how private interests have come to rule our economic lives, particularly, the more bigger, the more transnational today, it seems they have a greater sway than ever before in our lives. Industrialization of production, and this, of course, goes back often in these accounts of modernity to the Industrial Revolution in England. But then, of course, the idea of industrialization, the processes of industrialization, the infrastructures of industrialization have been spread around the world over the last 3 centuries. Urbanization, similarly, the intensification, the growth of urbanization is often considered to be a central feature of modernity. The predictions are made about how many more people will move into urban areas by 2030 or by 2050. That's if today it's 55% of the population of the world that's living in urban areas, by 2050 it's going to be 70%, and therefore a lot more transformation or a lot more technology is required to sustain those ways of living in urban areas. Equally, bureaucratization of all kinds of organization, not just in the state, but also in other organizations, civil society organizations, private corporations. And people who celebrate modernity, particularly in certain Eurocentric framings, also like to emphasize its role in democratization, particularly of all kinds of political relations, not just in the state, but beyond. And also, equally, the idea that we are looking forward, we're always worrying about what kinds of futures we are going to realize through societal change as moderns. Now, in these mainstream social sciences and humanities approaches, a lot of them are, of course, either developed in Europe or influenced by those developments in Europe around the world, tend to neglect, perhaps outside of certain Latin American contexts, the notion of coloniality. And of course, this coloniality came, according to these Latin American scholars, and increasingly people around the world, including in Africa, but less so in South Asia, is the idea that coloniality that we see today came out of European colonialisms of different parts of the world, but particularly of the Americas beginning in the late 15th century. And these represent domination, control over territories, peoples, and worlds. And building on this work, amidst, alongside some of the other theories of modernity that I just talked about, in our work, in our earlier work, directed mostly at an audience of sustainability studies, sustainability transition studies to be, but in particular, we argued that a lot of those transformations that we see, even in the name of sustainability today, are embedded inside this colonial modern political formation. And we identified 6 relations that we argued to be co-constituting of this world we call colonial modernity. And the feature of these 6 relations, we argued, is that they're not just connections or ties that are often studied in a social network or any other network, but rather knots that resist change, knots that can be bent, they can be resized. So in that sense, they can be enacted across all kinds of different scales, across time and space. So these are not ties in a network, but rather knots of different kinds. And we elaborated 6 such relations constituting colonial modernity, making colonial modernity today, and making our futures through colonial modernity. And these 6, obviously, Les already talked about them. The first one is about the construction of stratification, hierarchical orders based upon race, based upon gender, based upon intersections between the two, but also ethnicities and religions and so on. And these hierarchical orders rest upon these assumptions of comprehensive superiority for those who situate themselves above others in a racial hierarchy or whatever. Secondly, it's about the appropriation of cultural privileges from those who have been stratified as serving the ones at the top. So it's a relational production of inequalities around the world, and this can be, of course, local as well as global. Assertions of military supremacy, and of course, in the worst kinds of multiple violences have been inflicted throughout the last 500 years on people who have been othered and oppressed. in the name of empire, in the name of colonialism, through these relations. And the enforcement of gender domination of particular modern kinds, where everyday heteropatriarchal action, often through the imposition of certain kinds of binary genders on a variety of other ways of being, expanding toxic extraction, again, by designing social and material projects that enable doing that, and finally extending controlling imaginations. That means enacting colonial rule in all kinds of relational practices around the world. So these six constituting relations of colonial modernity, each one of them, as I said, is a kind of a knot that resists transformation as it's scaled up or scaled down, or even bent and folded in some ways. But together they form also something we call like a meshwork, that these different knots, they come together. And the technical term here, of course, to describe these, the mathematical term that we use in the essay to describe these knots is topology. And similarly, a meshwork is kind of a topology as well, that is formed by bringing of these knots together. When these knots flow into each other, when these relations one becomes the other, and one constitutes the other from within and from without, is what the meshwork tries to highlight. Now, of course, using these six relations and the meshwork that they form in the context of the genocide, the first one that comes to mind, obviously, is assertion of military supremacy. And here, many of you might know that Israel has been among the top exporters of major arms, as defined by SIPRI, the institute in Stockholm that studies these things, for quite a few years now in the world. It was, I think, number 9 between 2015 and 2019. And now for the last 5 years, between 2020 and 2024, Israel has been the 8th largest exporter of global arms, major arms, and that includes all kinds of helicopters, aeroplanes, ships, big artillery, and so on and so forth. And perhaps unsurprisingly, because India, before the current rise of Ukraine as an importer of weapons, India was the largest importer of weapons in the world. And now it's just slightly below Ukraine because of the war there. And India is the largest, by far, the importer of weapons from Israel. In fact, more than a third of the weapons that Israel sends around the world go to India. And of course, this military supremacy of Israel, this assertion of military supremacy, is tied in with all kinds of appropriated privileges through history, and not just for Israel, obviously, but also for many of the other, in fact, most of the other largest exporters of the world. They become large exporters through colonial relations, through the privileges and powers that they've accumulated through those relations. And India, of course, being one of the largest importers and being the largest importer from Israel, its position as an importer, of course, is constituted itself by colonial modernity. The fact that it's the colonial modern border built in 1947 due to the partition that was experienced in South Asia, which, by the way, also led to the death of millions of people in that process, and separation of multiple families, including my own parents, who had to move between countries and so on. Lots of violence was inflicted. And on that border, so today, again, as you might have seen in the news, threats of conflict loom quite large again. And of course, India's occupation of Kashmir is a major. Both of those, are connected with each other, obviously, and are major reasons behind why India is a major importer of weapons. And some artificial intelligence enhanced assault weapons that are used in Gaza are being partly produced by one of India's largest manufacturers of all kinds of things, including running airports and God knows what else, Adani. And they're also helping Israel manufacture these machine guns and assault weapons for use in Gaza. And it seems that was, according to some observers in India, that's one of the reasons why India has been refusing to call for a moratorium on exports and imports of weapons with Israel at the UN. And India is also, some of you might know, has sent thousands of workers to Israel since October 2023, since Palestinian workers were expelled. And of course, that ease with which India is able to send these workers obviously depends upon the fact that India itself is a country of huge unemployment, and depressed wages that are definitely connected with the way it is situated in the world economy, and that's a colonial modern world economy with its inequalities of severe kinds that continue to be pervading our existence across the global north and south. Now, I am going to stop here and pass for the remaining discussion of some of these relations of colonial modernity, particularly in relation to big tech and its role in the genocide in Gaza. So I have to stop sharing and pass the discussion on to my colleague, Kian.
Okay, thanks. So while we're shifting speakers, just a reminder that we want all questions to be put in the Q&A section, and then we can get an overview of the questions. So please do put some there. Over to you, Sean.
Thanks, Les. Thanks, Farnaz, for helping us get us set up earlier, and Sorb for opening up the conversation. Great stuff. I want to add some examples that maybe illustrate the complicities that Les mentioned first, and illustrate the meshwork and the colonially modern relations, the dynamics that stem from those relations along the way. And I guess the first thing I want to do, though, is really highlight some of the good work that has already been done, that maybe highlight some of the relationships, highlight some of the practices of innovation, of manufacturing, of production. And I guess in Anthony Lowenstein's case, highlights the testing and the experimentation in and on Palestinians and in and on Israel over the last few years. And certainly, you know, it's somewhat convincing that Palestine's become a laboratory for high-tech digital forms of mass surveillance, for the control and imagined control of population, and of course, great violence. And we know how this has been, or certainly Lowenstein's argument is how this has been upscaled through Israel's genocide in the past months, which involves colonial fantasies of identifying enemy threats, targeting them, defeating them. So let's have a look at some of the examples of these complicities and examples of these 6 relations that Sorb has identified, and we discuss in that essay that's been mentioned. Many of you will be familiar with this example. What I want to do is use this as a way to get at these knotty relations, in this case, knotty relations of asserting military supremacy on the one hand, and of imagining control on the other. Israel's Iron Dome, the associated technologies of autonomy, of artificial intelligence. And prior to 2023, I think this is an important point, prior to 2023, this helped facilitate imagined control via a certain kind of containment. It allowed Israel and others to make it, Israeli government and state officials and others to make claims that indeed the IDF was the most ethical armed force in the world, you know, which it continues to make in the face of ongoing genocide. So that imagined control here is really an important element of that. And I want to go back to a couple of things Sorb said to really help illustrate those perspectives. What we're dealing with here, what we're trying to highlight, is these mutually reinforcing interactions between imaginaries, imaginations of control on the one hand, and structures of wide-scale domination. And these aren't necessarily controlling in a strict machine-like sense, which is one of our important points here. But nevertheless, even with this fallacy of control, this imagination of control, we see patterns of superiorism, we see subjugation and othering, we see flows of extraction that Sorb has mentioned and highlighted, concentration and accumulation of capital and harms, and so on. So some examples to further illustrate this and further illustrate those relations. This one really hinges on Israeli claims of precise targeting of Palestinian terrorists in order to not just boost arms sales, to legitimize warfare, and I think to provide a kind of an ethical cover for much of what is going on. Here in these stories, we see claims that Israel can pick out combatants. They can sort what they call terrorists from lay people. And I guess the important point for me to do here is to really highlight precision as a form of imagined control that continues to be deployed to justify whitewash assertions of military supremacy and so on. The other relation and the other dynamic that I want to really highlight here is this notion of assuming superiority, and the I guess the kind of subjectification through algorithmic assessment or other datafied assessment of civilians into terrorists, of others into targets worthy of targeting, and so on, and that's important. Okay, next example is the expansive extraction, fallacious control through relations with other governments. Again, Sorps highlighted the India Israel relations and the flows of people indeed that have come through the buying and selling weapons. Moving on to big tech, particularly, we could also think about the deployment of infrastructure, the building of platforms, of services, of data contracts at huge scales. And highlighted, and this is a story from this week, highlighted as much by the success as the opposition movements globally. The opposition, and this is from London. This is a story of Google DeepMind workers saying, no, we don't want you to. We don't want our parent company Google to abandon pledges, subsequently broken anyway, to develop AI technologies and put them into use in Palestine. Probably one of the most visible and reported projects over the last couple of years that has got some mainstream coverage since 2023 is Project Nimbus. Project Nimbus is a big tech infrastructure project, a cloud service, $1.2 billion contract between Alphabet, Google, Amazon, and the Israeli government in the first instance to provide a range of different public digital services. In an article by Time magazine, they showed, however, how the Ministry of Defense in Israel has its own what they call a landing zone into the Nimbus infrastructure, using what was called civilian infrastructure for military purposes. And this landing zones included cloud use by 2 government-owned manufacturers of drones, missiles, and other weapons, and so on. What this, I think, if we broaden out and we broaden out our focus and look at artificial intelligence in particular here, and stay with the idea of thinking about complicities and these colonially modern relations that we see knotted at these sites, these knotting relations that resist change, as Saurabh said, we can look particularly here at the use of artificial intelligence, I think, as a way of showing how these have been enacted in making colonial modernity. And so sort of mentioned the appropriation of cultural privileges with artificial intelligence, with services and platforms like ChatGPT, large language models. We see this perhaps at an unprecedented scale, this hoovering up, this sucking up of knowledge, cultural artifacts, and so on, and being deployed elsewhere. We certainly see assumptions of comprehensive superiority, not just in examples such as the Iron Dome, but in this much more perhaps mundane example of data cleaning services, again used by ChatGPT, also used by Meta, Facebook, to essentially protect clients, users in Western countries, but built on colonial relations of exploitation, which have created institutional settings, in this case in Kenya, which allow them to bring on cheap labor, regardless of the harms that this work does there. AI and some of the surveillance, some of the targeting technologies we see deployed in Palestine also enforce gender domination, also enforce racial and other biases there, and there's been much work on that. Here we get to see how these relate at this specific site. I've talked about the embedded visions in militaristic supremacy, but to acknowledge that again, and the expansion of controlling imaginations, how a very small number of firms really through promises of control, promises of precision and efficiency, gain an increasing say on economic decisions and decisions on, say, resource allocation that are globally tied together. The last of these kind of knotty relations that I want to highlight here when talking about AI is the expansion of toxic extraction, which is critical for the rare earth minerals and other supply chain flows and features. That's important. And I guess this is an example that brings quite a few of these relations together in ways that Saurabh was talking about. Just a couple of slides to go to just give another couple of examples of this. I guess by generating targets in Gaza, as I've said here, this Nimbus and specifically the Lavender AI system that was built on top of Nimbus, other algorithmic systems such as Gospel has helped justify mass murder. It's helped provide cover, ethical cover, assuage guilt about genocide, and so on. And I think this quote from one Israeli intelligence officer is really important in that regard. The machine did it coldly, that made it easier, and the targets, who of course are people, keep coming. Last slide for me, a little bit more on expansive extraction and these kind of global tech and the circuits of coloniality. Saurabh's talked about the kind of Adani and relationships with India in particular. We see other examples here, and I think this we also see examples in the kind of flow of finances, of investments that not only supply capital but shelter capital in various parts of the world, and certainly that's been a big story in the venture capital that has built up such a concentration of power and privilege, I think, within the big tech sector over the last 15 years particularly since the 2008 crash. They're the examples I want to cover, and I hope there's some stuff that's familiar to you there that helps kind of exemplify some of the ideas we've talked about. So maybe you'd come in on this final slide and kind of wrap up our part of the proceedings.
Okay. Thanks, Kane. Yeah, so, the 6 relations we sort of try to show how they're enmeshed in the making of the genocide. Of course, bringing in technology, as Kane has just done, centrally to the making of colonial modernity. Of course, then our discussion of these restrictions, of course, points to anti-colonial antidotes, and among them we articulate in this essay 6. The first, obviously, is the ensuring of comprehensive, struggles for comprehensive equality. That is definitely required around the world, but perhaps nowhere more acutely than in Palestine, to dismantle all kinds of cultural and epistemic stratifications that exist. Secondly, the restoration of cultural privileges for Palestinians, return of land, water, and other bases of life. Thirdly, practicing values of care that can counter all kinds of fallacies of control that are related to tech that Keynes talked about, and control over, more generally, over Palestinian territories through not just tech, but other means, militaristic means of different kinds, and Palestinian lives. Fourth, we briefly mentioned the question of reparative justice and how these commitments must be enacted in the context of Palestine, and perhaps designed and led by Palestinian women and children, given that they've borne the brunt of the recent attacks, of the recent genocidal violence as well in Gaza, and also, great examples of women's leadership in enacting reparative justice from other parts of the world as well, from North America all the way to Kurdistan, Rojava. Fifth, we talk about the importance of nurturing demilitarizing movements around the world. It's perhaps never more important than today, again, at least never more important in my lifetime, perhaps, than today, given how many wars there are going on, given the genocidal violence in Gaza, that we must fight for peace, must fight for intercultural conviviality. And finally, last but not the least, the question of many worlds, that there are many ways of living on the planet and still thriving in some parts of the world, as exemplified perhaps by the number of languages that are still being spoken around the world. And these many worlds perhaps might have a room also in Palestine to thrive again, to flourish again, building again on all kinds of decolonial ways of relating, rather than the colonial ways of relating that we've tried to illustrate in the last half an hour or 40 minutes. So thank you very much. That's it for us. We welcome questions, comments, feedback, and of course, Tahrir's comments first. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. That's great. And please do put questions into the Q&A section. Okay, Tahrir Hamdi, tfadali.
Okay. My voice is not helping, but I'm going to do my best. Thank you very much for your article, first of all, and for your presentations. Actually, wherever I go now, I'm always quoting your article. We just had a conference and we were talking about the same topic, and I was like, there's a new article that talks about the 21st century colonial genocide that argues. So I think this is a really important article. But before I begin with my comments that I prepared, I just wanted to comment on some of the political catchwords that are used often, and sometimes the way we use language, I think, is very important in terms of what kind of narrative they tell. For example, often on the news, whether it's BBC or Guardian or CNN or The Independent or sometimes even left-leaning news organizations will say hostages when they refer to the Israeli hostages, and prisoners when they refer to Palestinians. And I think we need to be careful here. Now, a lot of the Israeli hostages, or many of them, were actually Israeli soldiers, okay? So we need to keep this in mind. Israeli soldiers that were positioned on the border between Gaza and occupied Palestine, and their job was to snipe. They were snipers, and they more often than not have killed people. That's one thing. Palestinian prisoners. Now, one of the Palestinian prisoners that was released in the latest or the most recent deal between Israel and the Palestinian resistance was Ahmad Manasra. Ahmad Manasra was a 13-year-old child when he was imprisoned by Israel. So why would he be a prisoner and Israeli soldiers would be hostages? Another thing, this is a term that I hear so many people use. People from the UK, people from the US, and people in the Arab world. Israel-Palestine. We say Israel-Palestine, and sometimes Palestine-Israel. But I don't think that this is a very fair or clear term, because some people will, a lot of critics will say, Israel-Palestine violence. Whose violence exactly? Israel-Palestine? Are we talking on, is it equal? So I think we need to be more careful with using this phrase. I would prefer occupied Palestine if we're referring to the area geographically, or Israel or the Zionist entity if we're talking about Israeli violence, etc. Now, why is that? Because the way I view it as a Palestinian, and I hear many Israelis like Ilan Pape, Michael Piled, many others, Israel Shahak, who call, all of them call Israel a colonial project, a genocidal colonial project. So I think language, as a person interested in both linguistics and literature, language is very important. Okay. Your article actually helped me think about so many things that I couldn't quite describe. So I'll read my prepared comments and then very quickly talk about what it helped me with. Okay, so it has become increasingly evident to the world, I think, that the continued existence of Israel relies on extreme and brutal measures, particularly through the ongoing expulsion and extermination of the Palestinian people. As of this webinar, Israel continues its heavily funded genocidal campaign, or what Surab, Les, Kian, and Andy have recently described as the world's 21st century colonial genocide, perpetrated against the Palestinian people in Gaza. This genocidal campaign involves using some of the most destructive weapons available, such as American-made 2,000-pound bombs on civilians who are sheltering in tents. And I know several of those people who are sheltering in tents after multiple displacements over the past year and a half. Gaza has been left in ruins with almost nothing left to destroy except more human lives, the constant bombing of flesh and blood. As the world watches the genocide of the Palestinian people unfold, documented by survivors themselves in videos shared across social media platforms. Now, with the intentional silence and silencing of the world regarding the genocide of the Palestinian people, including the complete scholasticide and epistemicide of Gaza's institutions. By the way, all 12 of Gaza's universities have been completely destroyed, as well as the ongoing ecocide of Palestinian landscapes in besieged Gaza and the occupied West Bank. It is essential to focus on resistance in all its forms, not only in occupied Palestine, but across the globe. And when we talk about scholasticide, I think we need to think about it even, in personal terms. I knew one of those professors who was intentionally targeted and killed, and his name was Rifat Al-Arair. You probably heard of Rifat, I don't know. He's the one who wrote the poem, If I Must Die. Now, Rifat never carried a gun. This is the most dangerous item or tool that Rifat ever carried. And he would say things like, if the Israeli army came barging into my house with their guns, I'm going to throw, the strongest or the tool I have in my home, a ballpoint pen. But anyway, the Israeli army called Rifat. He was sheltering in a school, I think, and they told him, we know where you are, and we're coming after you. So he left the school, an UNRWA school, I think, and he went to his sister's house. And that's where they killed him, his sister, her children, and his brother. Why? Because Rifat used his ballpoint pen to write or to say things on Twitter. Okay, so let me go back and continue with my prepared statement. It is time, I say, to dismantle this network of power structures, the systems, machinery, the infrastructure, and the very logic that enables the continuation of Zionist settler colonialism. As today's guests argue, brutal Zionist settler colonialism survives through the systematic and systemic support of what they call colonial modernity, which must be dismantled. And for it to be dismantled, this requires a thorough understanding of the, again, I'm quoting from your article, relational meshwork of colonial modernity. Global resistance can take various forms, such as teaching about Palestine, writing and publishing on the subject, protesting for Palestine, boycotting Zionist institutions and businesses, and pressuring the power centers that enable Zionist settler colonialism and ongoing genocide. The genocidaire has attempted to control the narrative discourse with terms such as anti-Semitism, a political catchword that not only silences any discussion on Palestine, but also labels opposition to the wanton killing of civilians, the majority of whom are women and children in Gaza, as anti-Semitic. In parallel with the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians on the ground in both Gaza and the West Bank, many academics around the world are cleansing their own language when discussing the genocide in Gaza. They engage in rhetorical acrobatics to avoid being called anti-Semitic. But now is a time for defiance, strength, and confrontation. What we call sumud in Arabic, steadfastness in the face of oppression. It is time to confront the enablers of the world's 21st century colonial genocide. Now, perhaps Gaza has brought about a much needed clarity to the world. And here I would like to quote from Ghassan Kanafani's short story, A Letter from Gaza. By the way, Ghassan Kanafani was a Palestinian writer, activist, thinker, and he wrote novels and short stories, and one of them was called A Letter from Gaza, and he was assassinated along with his niece Lamis in the year 1972 in Beirut. He was only 36 years old, very young. Okay, so here I'd like to quote from Ghassan Kanafani's short story, A Letter from Gaza, in which the narrator, writing from Gaza, addresses his friend in the United States. And these are the words of Ghassan Kanafani. I won't come to you, but you, return to us, come back, to learn from Nadia's leg, amputated from the top of the thigh, what life is and what existence is worth. Come back, my friend. We are all waiting for you. By the way, this story was published in the year 1956. Okay? All right. But today, Gaza has the largest number of child amputees in modern history, according to the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. Our guest article, titled Confronting the World's 21st Century Colonial Genocide, addresses several critical aspects of this ongoing genocide, which the authors attribute to what they call colonial modernity. And I think through your presentations, you explained it really well. But, you know, I was thinking, what inspired you to write this article? And I ask this because, like many others, and we discussed this particular question at the conference we had at my university, I have struggled to make sense of a world that has largely remained silent while a live stream genocide continues into its second year. I mean, we all can see it. You've all seen the videos. You've all seen the charred bodies. You've all seen the headless babies. You've all seen the complete devastation of Gaza. And if I can very quickly just share a slide that I prepared. I don't know if I can do it. Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah. So these are, after the most recent ceasefire between Israel and the Palestinian resistance, a million Gazans returned to their homes in the rubble. They have no more homes left, of course. 1 million of them walked on foot. These people are determined to stay on their land, even if it's all rubble. You can see them all here, walking back home to their homes in the rubble. Okay, stop sharing. What I was just going to maybe like read off, after showing you that, read off something that Trump said, something very arrogant and genocidal. He was just talking about cleaning out Gaza. So he says, this is Trump. I said to him that I'd love you to take on more. I guess he's talking about an Arab leader. because I'm looking at the whole Gaza Strip right now, and it's a mess. It's a real mess. You're talking about 1.5 million people, actually in Gaza, 2.3 million, but he says 1.5 million. Maybe that's, he estimates some 100,000 or 200,000 were killed or more. You're talking about 1.5 million people, and we just clean out that whole thing. I don't know, something has to happen, but it's literally a demolition site right now. Almost everything's demolished and people are dying there. So I'd rather get involved with some of the Arab nations and build housing in a different location where I think they could maybe live in peace for a change. He's going to clean out Gaza. Of course, he's going to clean out Gaza using extermination and expulsion. Talking about insects and not even animals, because I think there would be more humanity. Can we call it humanity? There would be more humanity towards animals than there would be, I guess, towards insects. So that's how bad it's gotten. And when you say the 21st century colonial genocide, you were talking about, of course, the United States and India, and of course, the UK is a participant, so is Germany and France and different European countries. But unfortunately, so are the Arabs. They're part of the whole web thing. They're part of the whole meshwork, aren't they? There's a lot of money going around into that machinery and technology, the AI, lavender AI to kill people in Gaza. So when we think about, well, why is it continuing? Because every government, it seems, the world over, is part of this colonial modernity. I don't know if I have other things, but let me go to my questions. You've already answered some of them, but I do want to ask you, go back and ask you what inspired you to write this article. And also, I would like to know, how can such a powerful structure of domination and control, as you know, this colonial modernity is, be confronted and dismantled? And how might we realize the kind of global mobilization necessary to bring about a decolonial world rooted in reparative justice and demilitarization, as you argue in your article? So that's my bit. Back to you, Les.
Okay, shukran jazilan. Yeah, that's great. So now, well, the other speakers, and including Andy Sterling, are welcome to respond to Tahir's questions, and then we can go on to any other questions. And since there weren't any in the chat, I put one to fill the gap, but by the time they finish, there might be more questions. So go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Tahir. If anybody else wants to jump in, Kian, Andy, Les, please do so. I've already spoken, but I'm happy to address some of Tahir's questions too. If you want me to go first, just let me know. What do you think is best, Les and Andy and Kian?
Well, perhaps, I mean, Saurabh and Andy, I think, initiated the article and then quickly brought in Sean and then me eventually. So maybe you two should answer that first question.
Somebody's hand is up, by the way. Julia Molinari.
Yeah, well, yeah, Julie, please put your question in the chat. All right, so Saurabh and Andy, maybe you should start speaking.
Yeah. Thank you. If I might go first, then Andy, then you can follow up if there's anything else to add. Yeah, is that okay, Andy?
Sure.
All right then. Thank you, Tahir. Thank you very much for the comments, for reading our essay and thinking it's useful. I hope, you know, obviously we hope that it would be in some respects when we wrote it. So thanks also for pointing out to the question of languages, particularly that are repeated uncritically in Western media. And you know, you're absolutely right. We have to be careful not to reproduce them in our own writings, in our own languages, in our own everyday conversations too. And I think in the essay that we wrote, we tried our best to be careful to not not reproduce uncritically those horrible divides. For example, Israeli hostages versus Palestinian prisoners and all of that. But if something did slip through, I think we will go back and have a careful look again and see that nothing is uncritically reproduced there. And secondly, the questions of what inspired us to write this article. And obviously the straightforward answer there is the question of solidarity. You know, a lot of us have been active in the protests, in the movement widely. I've been active in the movement for many, many years since I was a university student. I've been to Palestine as well. But I think the most recent, of course, it's basically an act in solidarity to begin with. And then secondly, we hoped that perhaps it might contribute to energizing in a small way, in the smallest way or whatever way, some of the global resistance against the genocide, against the occupation, against colonialism in Palestine. And obviously also our hope is also that we might, this might help or at least afford the often missing connections between different struggles. Because the world we highlight is also the world that is behind the destruction of the planet at large. So, struggles for climate justice, struggles for sustainability, huge movements for sustainability around the world could do better in terms of connecting, engaging with the pro-Palestine struggles as well, and the movement as well. And I think we were hopeful, or at least at the back of our minds, there was always this concern that maybe this can help connect those struggles, connect the dots between those struggles, because the world that we are confronting, whether it's in climate justice and sustainability justice struggles, or whether it's in pro-Palestine, it's sort of it is a similar formation. Of course, it takes form in many different ways in different parts of the world. But what we point to, the meshwork behind of these colonial relations, constitutive colonial, they are similar, and they should be all directly confronted. Now, your last question, as I saw it, how can such a powerful world, how can it be confronted, given its hegemony? I mean, it's everywhere to be found. It's to be found even in other worlds that are associated with indigenous peoples and all kinds of, artisans, which have until now managed to resist. And at least I'm not going to speak for any of my co-authors here. It's just my view. And of course, they are free to jump in at any point in time. I think what we have tried to do in these 6 relations is to point to we agree that not all 6 can be confronted. And there are more relations underpinning colonial modernity. Of course, it's a 530-year-old formation. And obviously, so much has happened around the world under its wings, under its aegis. But perhaps we could start with one relation, whatever that is. Let's say we want to start with the assumptions of comprehensive superiority or assertions of military violence in whatever movement we might be engaged in, and then ask, how does it link with some of the other dimensions, some of the other relations? Ask, well, if I am fighting against this assumption of comprehensive superiority and I want some kind of epistemic diversity to be seen in the world, to be embraced in the world, how does it then link with controlling imaginations? How does it then link with toxic extraction? How does it then link with military supremacy? And I think if we weave our analysis through like that, weave our engagement, weave our activism through like that, across these different relations, I think hopes for transformation might be helped. Hopes for decolonization might be helped. Hopes for the kind of decolonial transformations we argue are required from the modern world to the flourishing of many worlds, or the pluriverse around the world. And of course, demilitarized relations between them. So that would be my response to your great comments and questions, Tahrir, and also thank you for also all the other comments and ideas you brought to the table, which we of course didn't do as well as you did. So it's all great to hear from you and great to have your feedback. So
thank you very much, Saab. Thank you.
Thank you, Tahrir. And it's up to the others now to jump in as they.
I could jump in and compliment what you said, Saurabh. I agree with it strongly. And Tahrir, I just want to also thank you for your inspiring and moving words, and also it's very reassuring to us that you find some elements of this useful, and we really want to learn about how to improve it. What inspired me personally is very similar to Saurabh: horror, anger, solidarity, albeit ineptly expressed in some ways. And also, as someone who's too late in my career come to identify how important coloniality is to the kinds of forces and interests I've been dedicating my career to working against as an environmentalist and social justice activist and an academic, a sense of responsibility that I found myself in the context of sustainability, writing with various people and inspired by Saurabh especially, writing quite conceptual pieces. That's my personality defect. And then, but seeing this unfold and concerned that my understanding is, of course, so limited. My perspective is highly questionable, no matter what I may think, given my demographic. But at the same time, thinking you cannot seriously engage on these issues academically around coloniality without, as you said, Tahrir, taking seriously, making visible these horrific events. So those were the conjunction of things that inspired this article. And again, very briefly on your really crucial question about how to address these things, again, picking up from Saurabh, but one of the things about diagnosing colonial modernity as a driver, prescriptions are pretty risky if the diagnosis isn't really thought about. So expanding it to what may seem a very abstract and general thing is crucial if we want to act right. For instance, if we want to avoid critique itself being colonized, for instance, notions of scale, how can we act in our little scale on the big scale? This is a colonial understanding of hierarchy and stratification, which itself colonizes critique very often. So I'm inspired by dynamics like murmurations in nature, which are not scaled. When the time is right, these things move exquisitely. Culture does this. Progressive transformations of the past on gender, workers, race, such as they have been. When the time is right, they move very fast, and these oppressive structures can be overturned, albeit you have to be vigilant about how and what to. So giving compasses for these murmurations, not looking for controlling mechanistic plans for transformation, but giving people compasses to use. Our struggle, obviously inspired by much wider literature, was these dimensions are like little compasses that can be used, highly imperfect at the moment, indebted to other people thinking very hard about these factors. That's the spirit in which we offer this article as a tiny and provisional part of a much bigger struggle, like a murmuration of birds, finding together the opportunity to shift radically a different direction. I think that's how these huge structures like colonial modernity not only can be, but will inevitably in the end shift. The question is to what and how. Thank you though for your comments.
Thank you very much, and Andy, thank you. Does anybody want to say anything?
Yeah, it's something about modernity that for a long time there's been a critical perspective on capitalist modernity, leaving open the possibility that there are alternative forms of modernity, or post-capitalist or non-capitalist modernity. And this was already being elaborated around concepts of colonial control, especially by the Kurdish freedom movement as personified by Abdullah Öcalan. So when I came across the concept of colonial modernity in the published paper, that is in a journal by Saurabh and Andy, then I immediately saw the connection. So that was one say, intellectual political motive for me to get involved, because then the colonial modernity helps to clarify what we mean by capitalist modernity, because the two have been inseparable. I mean, since the colonial world also created the global capitalist system, starting with sugar plantations. And then a separate but related entry point was opposition to state repression here or anywhere, and the understanding that these forms have always gone back and forth between the metropolis and the empire. I mean, Michel Foucault commented on this in his Paris lectures in the mid-1970s, that those colonial forms always come back, perhaps in different ways, to the metropolis and then are re-exported. And, you know, Anthony Lowenstein's book explains that on a global scale about companies and governments. Or they use Palestine as a laboratory, but they also use their own countries as a laboratory. And we only know a small part of that interaction, the interchange between the different laboratories, because most of it is secret. So those are just two strands or two connections I made to the concepts in their previous article, which led me to get involved in the new one.
Les, I think all governments are afraid of the masses. And I just feel that if the masses are out there and all over the world, and they are able to weaken economies in different countries, but of course this would involve sacrifice. You have to sacrifice so much, and you have to overcome fear, and you have to overcome your fear of losing your comfort. If masses all over the world can weaken these economies, I think it would have they would go a far way into, weakening this whole meshwork that you're talking about. I was inspired by protests all across the world when I heard them shouting in their thousands, sometimes in their millions. They would say, in our thousands, in our millions, we are all Palestinians. Of course, they meant that in terms of, Palestinianism here, meaning the humanity of the world. And this is how I even interpret Kanafani's short story where he tells his friend Mustafa, who's in California, in Sacramento, to come back to Gaza, to learn from Nadia's amputated leg. And that was back in 1956. What was he asking him to come back to? I think he was asking him to come back to his humanity, to his, to his humanity and what life is worth. So I think we, as the world's population, we need to come back to our own humanity. So in our thousands, in our millions, then we all need to become Palestinian. And it really is a becoming. It's a revolutionary becoming, if I may describe it as such. I think you're getting a lot of questions in the chat if you want to check them. See what people are asking.
Yes, apologies to participants. I mean, this is the 10th webinar we've run, and in the past, the Q&A section always worked fine, but this time, it seems only the speakers had access to it, and we didn't realize that until about an hour after the webinar began. So that's why we opened the chat, and people have now put questions there. So I think I'll start with this one. As Israel becomes more isolated, I'll rephrase it, how can colonial modernity structure and hegemony be dismantled? That's a big question.
But it's an important one, I think, because Israel needs to be isolated. Unfortunately, it is not, because it has the world's support, not the people's support, but the governments. I mean, that's what is enabling this genocide. And it's not just the Western world or India. It's also, as I mentioned before, it's the Arab world as well, Arab governments. So, and silence and silencing is going really, it's having its impact. People are afraid to speak. They are being silenced in every way, in educational institutions, on the streets. So that's why I said that we need to overcome this kind of fear, fear of losing our comfort, fear of losing, when people are losing their lives on a daily basis in Gaza. Almost 100 is the average that get killed every day. And we're talking about people sheltering in tents. So if they're losing their lives, others can sort of overcome the fear of, let's say, losing a job or an opportunity, or anyway, yeah.
Les, you're muted.
Yeah. Before we bring back the other speakers, just a brief point further to the quote by Michel Foucault in the mid-70s. Yes, those colonial forms are increasingly being used to suppress protest or even dissent, to terrorize people into silence in the metropolis.
Same all over the world.
All over the world, including the metropolis that generated the oppression in the first place. And that's for reasons that should be obvious, because this whole global exploitative system is making life difficult for almost everyone.
And sometimes we are always self-censoring, even when we talk, let's say, somewhere like a general lecture in front of many people. We're always, self-censoring ourselves as well.
So it means the people in the mother country, or whatever we should call it, the imperial centers, increasingly have a motive, at least we can explain they should have a motive, to oppose this whole exploitative system of colonial modernity, because it's increasingly oppressing us too. And it's corrupting our role in society, making us servants of power. That's
Yeah.
By the way, that's the title of a book by Lauren Barrett in the 1970s, which had a formative influence on me, Servants of Power. Anyway, let's go move on to the other speakers for any comments.
Les, may I suggest, actually, just before we move on, this is what you talked about Foucault, but before that there was Aimé Césaire talking about the boomerang effect, or the imperial boomerang. And the Wikipedia page, it seems, does a good job of first talking about Césaire and then pointing out how Michel Foucault built on that argument. Apart from that, I wonder whether we should take a few more questions, because I think there are others since time is limited and I have to leave in about 10-15 minutes at the most.
Yeah, can I take a question, maybe, Sorb and Les and Co? But first of all, I want to say thank you for that incredibly engaged and forceful feedback that was incredibly useful for ongoing work that we're doing. So thank you very much. There's a question there on the digital. Do we see here an emergence, or is this a side of emergence of a new form of digital colonialism, coloniality? And I want to say two things on that. First, I think I'm certainly in no position to kind of comment on new forms of coloniality. If that's a useful way of drawing attention to something, let's go for it, right? And to be open about that. I think it's what might be worth thinking about in terms of that question, though, is what is new here? And if we go back to the meshwork and Denali relations, are we seeing new intensities, new concentrations, new, more forceful knots in and around certain places? And does that help us do what I think Sorb presented quite nicely at the end there of addressing maybe what gives some of those knots a particular kind of rigidity, and that would be my way into thinking about maybe intensities and concentrations and the forcefulness of the knottiness there. And absolutely, of course, there's intense power and privilege wrapped up in at those sites, but maybe that's a way in to start to address them.
Here's another question. How does the cooperation between India and Israel in arms and labor reflect the reproduction of colonial logic by the colonized? Does this challenge our understanding of decolonization? Now, I don't think it does, unless you thought that decolonization was something based on skin color and blood and tribe. You know, the colonial mentality is very much also a part of the, you know, that class of elites in colonized countries or previously colonized countries or so-called independent countries who are not really independent in any way. They are still very much dependent on the Western imperial center to prop them up and give them weaponry, but to use those weapons not against really other countries as much as to use them against their own people. So as you know, I mean, to be able to decolonize, it doesn't mean you have to be black or brown or Palestinian to, you know, to be able to, you know, believe in decolonization or even apply the ideas of decolonization. It's very much a belief. It's very much an affiliation. It's it is not based on you know, your any nativist ideas or your ethnic background or your skin color, religion, sect, etc. So I just think that your question very much, I mean, is answered by this great article about how to confront the world's 21st century colonial genocide, because really it is a world's genocide. Gaza and the genocide in Gaza is not simply being perpetrated by Israel against the Palestinians. It is very much an American, European, Israeli, Indian, Arab genocide that is being perpetrated against the Palestinian people in Gaza, the West Bank. Why? Because here, the Palestinian people or the liberation of Palestine would mean the liberation of the world from colonial modernity. And that's why you have this pushback from the whole world, I think. I don't know if I made myself clear.
That was great, Tahiri. Thank you for answering. I just want to add one small thing to it. In our analysis or in our discussion, in our framework as well, we talk about relations. We talk about colonial relations. We don't talk about who lies at the end of those relations as much directly. Of course, in the case of Israel and Palestine, it's clear. But if those colonial relations are ones that are topological in the sense that they are pervasive and very deeply embedded across societies, across modern societies, then it's not at all a surprise that now India, or at least the Hindu nationalist government in India, is on one of the ends of those colonial relations and imposing coloniality on all kinds of people from Kashmir to the northeast of India, and then helping Israel do it in Palestine.
Absolutely. Yes. Any other questions that you see?
I put one there when there weren't any. That is in the chat, in the Q&As, before I realized that no one else could put anything there. And that is in
I think,
2005, the Palestinian call for the BDS campaign, boycott, divestment, and sanction, emphasized international support for the Israeli regime as the target. That is, this recognized that it had been futile to protest against Israel as such, and that Israel represented all the Western regimes, and perhaps more, is doing their work. And so the call asked everyone to undermine and end that international support, meaning wherever we are, governments, companies, universities. So I pose the question, how does the concept colonial modernity help us to identify academic complicity in ways that might not otherwise be so obvious? So go ahead. Right.
Just a small part of that, Les, is that when it's realized not only that modernity itself is constituted by coloniality, it's not separate, but also that those things that are regarded conventionally as being modern, like, for instance, rationalistic, when I say are regarded, I mean by the hegemonic understanding in our societies, that modernistic thinking itself constitutes colonization. So, for instance, categorization, not seeing the world in terms of relations, seeing it in terms of categories. Thinking change has to be done by control, not by care. That you have to control to change anything. You have to get the cockpit. These are, no matter what side one is on, even if one, and especially damagingly, if one is a subaltern movement trying to challenge power, but with controlling categorical understandings, then one is inadvertently reproducing the relations that one is trying to resist. So academia is complicit in that in a way that few other parts of society are, especially, I would say, critical academia, where it actually frames its own critique in these modernistic and therefore ultimately colonial ways, objectifying the world, for instance, treating it like a machine. Then it is a crucial site for resistance of the kind that, of course, many have been writing about.
And I don't know if you've heard about, like, recently I was reading about universities in the UK and elsewhere that are complicit or involved in the arms industry that supplies Israel with the weapons to kill, kill, kill. So, I mean, how does an academic institution involve itself in this way in the production of very destructive weapons? So, I mean, that's just mind-boggling. I think Julia at the beginning had her hand up, but I don't know where she...
I think that was to alert us that the Q&A section wasn't working.
Ah, okay.
So that's why we opened the chat.
Yeah,
Okay.
that was the reason, because lots of references were being made to the chat and nobody was able to put anything in there.
There's something here.
I mean, we could take up Tahrir's question: how do universities act in complicity, apparently with no problem, for their policies on ethics and ethical investment? And I mean, one answer might be that they sanitize their involvement through various excuses and pretexts, and when I did my introduction, I gave some examples from the Open University. It means sometimes we sarcastically say, in response to its slogan, like open to ideas, people, and places, which was meant to be politically progressive a long time ago, and perhaps was to some extent, but now it means open to complicity with genocide. Under the neoliberal framework of free choice.
Yeah. There's a comment by Noman. It seems, he says, the statement made by President Trump may be because other power players behind the scenes, such as some real estate magnates, oil and gas tycoons, for example, etc., influence these types of horrific events. If this is the case, how would people identify these behind the scenes power players and influence them to take a more humane and empathetic approach on how they influence governments in a positive way rather than callously negative? That's a big question. Can these tycoons be influenced in a positive way, do you think? They just go where the big money is. They want to turn Gaza into a Riviera with hotels and casinos and clean it up. Just clean up the mess. The mess who created, I wonder.
I think as the apocryphal traveler asks the farmer, how do I get to this place? And the farmer said, start from here. I wouldn't start from this question because it doesn't lead anywhere except self-delusion.
Yeah.
I mean, it's impossible to persuade people who support global plunder and genocide to change their view. It will not achieve anything. The question is how to counter their power.
Well, individuals, whether it's a Trump, a real estate magnate, or a Musk created by electric vehicular sustainability donations from governments or subsidies or whatever they're called, they're all in a way symptoms of the kind of relations deformations that we are trying to highlight, right? So we need to fight these forces behind, forces that are relational, that are often not so tangibly visible to us, that are topological in the sense that they are hidden again under layers and layers of history, under layers and layers of technology and knowledges and cultural institutions and whatever not. I think that's our challenge today as academics, as people who have the luxury and time to sit down and think. But how do we recognize those relations, and how do we then go about finding, helping, contributing to ways, struggles through which they can perhaps be dismantled or radically transformed? So I think rather than getting bogged down by the tycoons and their individual personalities and whatever the words they utter of utter bullshit, sometimes we have to focus on the formations behind them, such as colonial modernity, and for people who do racial capitalism work, then those people who do settler colonialism work, then those, and so on. Les, I have to, at that note of mine,
Okay.
I have to run. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Well, thanks for your great contribution. And we usually finish by now. It's almost 2 hours since we began. So, Farnaz, is it time to close?
Yes, I think so, Les, if that's okay with everyone. So first of all, thank you to the speakers. I think it's been a really brilliant webinar for all of your insights. Also, apologies for the technical issues that happened today. Thank you so much for your patience with that. Thanks for everyone who's managed to stay with us as well for this long. We will be uploading this webinar to our YouTube channel, so please do check that out as well, and you'll find our other webinars on there. But thanks again very much, everyone.
Thank you,
thanks.
Thank you,
so
Les.
much.
Thanks, folks. Really appreciate it.
Thanks.